Deserved by no one, yet accessible to all, divine mercy is the greatest attribute of God. It runs silently throughout human history, at times almost unseen, yet it is as unstoppable as a raging river. In Central Europe, during the war-ravaged first half of the 20th century, as this river of mercy coursed its way through Poland, it entered into the lives of three seemingly insignificant people. Although they lived at precisely the same time, as close as 15 miles apart, they never actually met. Yet destiny would unite them forever. If a snapshot in time could be taken of their lives in the spring of 1938, it would reveal three individuals unaware they were heading toward a painful yet glorious future. In the backwater town of Wadowice, an 18-year-old high school valedictorian attends his graduation ceremony. His plans are to become an actor in Poland. Instead, the role he will play would be on a much larger global stage. At the same time, 15 miles away, inside this convent in Krakow, a 33-year-old nun, confined to her bed, lies dying of tuberculosis. She will later be celebrated as one of the great mystics of the Catholic Church. And near the Polish capital of Warsaw, a 44-year-old Franciscan priest strolls the grounds of his friary, quietly praying. Within 3 years, he will die a brutal martyr's death and be called the saint of our difficult age. Despite their humble and ordinary beginnings, the lives of these three figures have gone on to inspire untold millions to trust confidently in God's mercy and become channels of that mercy themselves. Their prophetic legacy reminds mankind that within the grasp of every soul is the awesome gift to receive and dispense mercy. And it is through the simple and unnoticed, rather than the great and honored, that this gift most often emerges. It courses steadily through the everyday lives of ordinary people. People like Maureen Daigen, a wife and mother from Massachusetts, who experienced divine mercy in a very dramatic way.
I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to hear mercy. I didn't want to hear God. I didn't want to hear Mass, confession. I didn't want to hear anything about religion at all.
Since age 14, Maureen Daigen suffered from Milroy's disease, a rare, incurable, and virtually untreatable disease of the lymphatic system. Causing severe pain and massive swelling, the disease forced Maureen to undergo a tragic amputation of her left leg when she was only 17. The disease, however, was not only to plague Maureen's life physically, but mentally and spiritually as well. In her late 20s, as her condition worsened, despair began to close in.
I had been on seizure medications because I was having seizures at the time because of stress. I was on antidepressants, and I was on heavy pain medication, and I started to abuse the drugs. I was addicted to the drugs. And I remember one day saying to Bob, you know, at least people with cancer, their time is probably numbered, the days are probably numbered. I said, but mine aren't, and I wish they were. I don't find life worth living.
Maureen Daigen's circumstances, however, would soon become even more tragic. In early 1981, doctors told Maureen that her remaining leg would now have to be amputated. The surgery meant she would be confined to a wheelchair, a double amputee for the rest of her life. She was not even 30 years old. Searching for some way to help his wife cope with the inevitable, Maureen's husband, Robert, met with a Catholic priest. The priest suggested Robert encourage Maureen to consider a private pilgrimage to a Catholic shrine in Poland. Though reluctant at first, Maureen finally agreed to the pilgrimage. On March 28, 1981, she arrived here at the convent chapel of the Sisters of Mercy in Krakow. Inside the chapel was the tomb of Sister Faustina Kowalska, the Polish nun who died of tuberculosis in 1938.
And we went into the chapel at night. They were renovating it during the day, so you had to wait till the night to go in, till the sisters cleaned it. And We went in and we were praying the chaplet specifically for a healing. And I thought, oh, healing, this is crazy. You know, I thought I have to be insane. And then I thought I heard Faustina say in my heart, if you want something, just ask. So I said, okay, to myself, no one could hear me. It's okay, Faustina, you dragged me this far from home. If you're going to do something, then do it now.
No one was prepared for what happened next.
The pain left and the swelling was gone instantly.
The severe pain which had crippled Maureen for the past 18 years vanished instantly as she prayed in front of Sister Faustina's tomb. And the massive swelling in her leg decreased so quickly, Maureen had to stuff her shoe with tissue to keep it from slipping off. She would also find that her dependency on pain medication had miraculously disappeared as well. The Daigens returned to the United States and headed immediately for the doctor's office.
When I walked into his office on my crutches and he looked at my leg, it was just like he couldn't believe it. He said, this is just unbelievable. He said, it's an incurable disease. And then I had told him I was on and off buses, and he just had a really, you know, he was just flabbergasted.
Other doctors, including a cardiologist, an internist, and 2 vascular surgeons, investigated Maureen's miraculous recovery. But they were unable to find any medical reason for the cure. Although the cure happened instantaneously, it would be 11 years before it was officially declared a miracle by the Roman Catholic Church. This official declaration of Sister Faustina's miraculous intercession signaled the arrival of a time when the entire world would discover the great spiritual inheritance left to it by this obscure Polish nun. This spiritual inheritance came in the form of a divine mission that began in 1905, when Sister Faustina was born Helena Kowalska in the Polish village of Głogowiec.
Było nas 10, 2.
There were 10 of us. 2 sisters died young, soon after they'd been born. So there were 8 of us. It was hard, very hard. The soil is very poor around here. Father was a carpenter, so that helped a bit.
The 13 rugged acres owned by Faustina's father barely kept the Kowalska family alive. Faustina's brother, Mieczysław, says his sister never complained. Instead, he remembers her as someone always trying to love God in simple ways.
She was a really good girl. Sometimes we'd graze the cattle and she'd decorate wayside shrines. She wouldn't go with the other girls. And she kept telling our parents that one day she'd go on a pilgrimage.
What no one knew was that the pilgrimage Faustina spoke of was a spiritual one, and in reality it had already begun. Her spiritual journey started at an early age inside St. Kazimier's parish church, where Faustina was baptized as an infant. It was also here at age 7 she heard for the first time an interior voice within her soul, calling her to love more perfectly.
As a very young girl, having received First Communion, on her way back home she was asked by a neighbor, "Why are you walking alone and not with the other girls?" And she replied, "I'm not walking alone, I'm walking with the Lord Jesus." And throughout her life to the end, she nurtured the awareness of God's presence in her soul.
By the time Faustina turned 16, she began expressing an ardent desire for religious life. This distressed her parents, because her absence would mean less help and the loss of family income. They subsequently discouraged the idea, and Faustina stayed in Głogowiec. But 3 years later, in July of 1924, weeks before her 20th birthday, a pivotal event in Faustina's life occurred near this tree. It catapulted her into a remarkable series of spiritual experiences that would alter the course of her short life forever.
One day on a Sunday, she went with her sister and their friends to a dance in a Łódź park. And there, while she was dancing, Jesus, very much in pain, appeared to her, and he said, "How long are you going to lead me astray? How long am I going to suffer because of you?" She left the dance right away and went to the Łódź Cathedral, and there, lying prostrate on the floor, asked Jesus to give her an answer, to tell her what she was to do next. Jesus told her to go to Warsaw right away. You'll enter a convent there.
Assured of what she must do, Faustina left for Warsaw at once. There she was rejected at every convent door except one, the Congregation of the Sisters of Our Lady of Mercy, a religious order dedicated to helping prostitutes reform their lives. After Faustina entered the Sisters of Mercy, her superior, in her notes, assessed the new novice as no one special, and put Faustina to work to pay for her religious clothing.
She was a simple, uneducated nun, with just 3 grades of elementary schooling. She rarely left the convent and performed the most mundane tasks. Her life appeared so ordinary on the outside. She was busy working and spent part of her time in the chapel. Every day she met the same people. Her day had the same rhythm. So on the outside, she led a dull, humdrum existence.
Beneath her perceived dull existence, Faustina's deep inner life overflowed with extraordinary mystical graces, divine revelations, and heavenly visitations. Christ began appearing frequently to her in visions, sometimes as the King of Mercy, resplendent in light and majesty. At other times he appeared as the tortured, crucified Christ. At the request of her spiritual director, Faustina began privately to record these mystical experiences in a diary.
She didn't have a newspaper, she didn't have the radio to reach people, and she didn't travel. All she had were her little notebooks and a pen. She had neither an office nor a secretary. She herself was a secretary of Divine Mercy. She just quietly kept on writing in her journals, in those little notebooks of hers. She'd describe her conversations with Jesus.
It was to this novice, considered no one special by her superior, that Jesus Christ would quietly entrust a great mission. Christ instructed Faustina to remind the world about God's unfathomable mercy. She was to accomplish this by introducing new devotional practices to honor mercy, and by establishing a worldwide movement of souls dedicated to spreading divine mercy. Jesus directed Faustina to proclaim to the world that even the worst and most hopeless sinner was deserving of God's infinite mercy. It is divine mercy, he said, that will determine the future destiny of the world.
Speak to the world about my mercy. Let all mankind recognize my unfathomable mercy. It is a sign for the end times. After it will come the day of justice. While there is still time, let them have recourse to the fount of my mercy.
Because Christ desired this urgent message of mercy for the entire world, Faustina's mission would have far-reaching implications, but it would also meet with much opposition. Accepting it would often come at a high price. Faustina was to endure a silent, tedious day-to-day martyrdom. Most of her life inside the convent was spent in poor health because of tuberculosis, and she was ridiculed by her convent sisters who labeled her as lazy or eccentric. On a spiritual level, Faustina's suffering was even more intense. She sometimes struggled against feelings of doubt and despair. But she prevailed over these emotions with the conviction that her sufferings were redemptive and had great meaning, thus displaying heroic faith in God. But Christ continued to remind Faustina that even the strongest faith is of no avail without works. And because of this, he wanted people to practice mercy daily through deed, word, and prayer. Souls could accomplish this by means of the new devotions Christ entrusted to Faustina.
Jesus even told Faustina he wanted those who believed in him to perform at least one act of mercy a day. Not just any good deed, but one especially for the love of him. Not just any good acts or philanthropy motivated by something else. The condition is that at least one good act a day, in word or deed or prayer, should be done for the love of Jesus.
Faustina herself was presented with many such opportunities to practice mercy. One difficult example came during a family visit to her parents' home in February 1935, when she was asked by a family friend to pick up a dirty and diseased child.
One of these friends came with a child whose eyes were diseased and filled with pus, and she said to me, "Sister, take it in your arms for a moment, please." My nature recoiled, but not paying attention to anything, I took the child and kissed it twice, right on the infection, asking God to heal it.
Faustina realized that small, often insignificant acts of mercy, especially when met with ingratitude, are of infinite worth in the eyes of God, since even they allow God's river of mercy to flow through human lives.
I see that the smallest things done by a soul that loves God sincerely have an enormous value in His holy eyes.
Jesus desired to leave a constant reminder of his divine mercy by means of this image. He appeared to Faustina in a vision on February 22, 1931, and instructed her to have the image painted according to the pattern she saw. Christ stated that if we are to receive God's mercy, then we need to trust and be merciful to others.
Jesus said clearly that the title of the icon should include the words, "Jesus, I trust in you." He demanded that these words be included in the title. Why? Because trust is the first response to the recognition of the mystery of divine mercy. The more one knows how kind God is, the more one trusts in Him. And trust is like a bucket to draw upon God's graces.
Christ promised many graces to those souls who venerated this image of divine mercy.
I am offering people a vessel with which they are to keep coming for graces to the fountain of mercy. That vessel is this image with this signature, "Jesus, I trust in you."
Sister Faustina's great trust endured to the very end of her life. On October 5, 1938, Faustina died at age 33 in this room at her convent in Krakow. Because of her humility and silence regarding her extraordinary inner life, many of those who lived and worked with Faustina for more than 13 years still believed she was no one special. Faustina's death, however, did not end the work Christ had begun in her. Her diary and the image of divine mercy are now perpetual vessels of grace, constantly reminding the world that God's mercy penetrates even into the deepest and most hopeless recesses of human misery. That misery reached a dark summit at Auschwitz during World War II. Auschwitz was the Nazi concentration camp that mass-produced unspeakable kinds of human misery. Incredibly, it was located less than 30 miles from Faustina's peaceful convent. It was in Auschwitz, while awaiting his own execution in this cell, that prisoner Stefan Jastrzębski carved this image of Christ crucified into his cell wall. To Catholics, the crucifix represents the core Christian image, personifying God's limitless mercy flowing out to the lost souls of every age. Strangely, just 3 cells down from where Jastrzębski carved the crucifix into the wall was another cell that would contain yet another image of mercy. But this image was alive and appeared in the form of a Franciscan priest who became mercy incarnate for this man, Francis Gajowniczek, an Auschwitz prisoner sentenced to death by starvation. Gajowniczek's haunting story about his life inside the camp is a compelling tale of deliverance. In fact, he has made sharing that story his life's work.
I said to him before we left for Hyannis, "You don't have to go and give this talk. it's going to be a taxing drive for you. He says, no, I want to do it. Then en route, I could see he was getting tired. It was a long drive. I said to him, we don't have to keep going. We can turn around and go back to Granby, and I'll just give your apologies. He looked at me ever so calmly and said, the debt still has to be repaid.
That debt stems from the events that took place here in 1941 in the death camp's roll call square. Francis Gajowniczek and the other prisoners of Cell Block 14 were hastily assembled at gunpoint by German SS guards. It was here Gajowniczek's name and the name of another prisoner, number 16670, were forever and inseparably linked. Number 16670's real name was Raymond Kolbe. Like Sister Faustina, Kolbe had been on a spiritual journey, one that would come to a dramatic end in this German death camp. This journey that brought him to Auschwitz for his brief but inconceivable encounter with Francis Gajowniczek began when Kolbe was just 10 years old.
He was a very lively boy, and a very good boy, but at the same time mischievous. And apparently he exasperated his mother on one occasion, and Maria Kolbe threw up her arms and said, Ramanduccio, which is a term of endearment. Little Raymond, whatever's going to become of you. And there was something in her voice, but also it was the grace of God that hit him, obviously. What is going to become of me?
Pondering that question shook 10-year-old Raymond to his very core. A few days later, while he prayed alone here at this side altar in his village church of St. Matthew in Pabianice, Poland, the Virgin Mary appeared to little Raymond. The Mother of God emerged from this painting of herself, resplendent in light, clothed as a majestic queen. In her hands, which she extended to Raymond, she held 2 crowns.
She offered him a white crown of purity and a red crown of martyrdom, and she said to him, which of these crowns do you want for the rest of your life? The white crown of purity or the red crown of martyrdom? With all the gusto and enthusiasm of a 10-year-old, he said, give me them both.
That apparition of the Virgin Mary would not only be the defining moment that determined the course of Raymond Kolbe's life, but it also contained a prophecy indicating an unnatural and cruel death.
And Maria said that she was convinced that this was a true apparition because of the great change that took place in him. He became more serious beyond his years, much more obedient, and not apparently nearly as mischievous as he was before.
6 years later, inspired by the preaching of 2 Franciscan missionaries, 16-year-old Raymond entered the conventual Franciscan order. There he received his habit, took the religious name Maximilian, and started a life befitting the prophecy of the white crown of purity. Beginning in 1912, the highly intelligent Kolbe began studying for the priesthood in Rome, eventually earning doctorate degrees in both philosophy and theology. Because of the enormous impact of the Virgin Mary's appearance to Kolbe as a child, Maximilian's devotion to the Mother of Christ became central to his spirituality. He was convinced that the shortest, surest way to conversion and personal sanctification was consecrating oneself to God through Mary. It was in Rome in 1917, while still a seminarian, that Kolbe was inspired to form a religious movement, a spiritual army of Catholics consecrated to the Mother of God, under her title of the Immaculate Conception. He called this movement the Militia Immaculatae, or MI. It would devote itself to worldwide evangelization by dedicating itself to Christ through Mary. In 1919, the newly ordained Father Maximilian left Rome and returned to Poland. While teaching in Krakow, Kolbe immediately began forming small MI prayer groups consisting of dedicated lay people. By 1922, anxious to accomplish still more for the Immaculata, the 28-year-old priest looked for a more effective way to flood Poland with Christ's gospel. He soon discovered that opportunity by publishing a religious magazine.
He went to his provincial to ask permission to do this, and the provincial said, well, we cannot afford to do that. And Kolbe promised him, you wouldn't have to pay anything, I'll raise the money for it. And so he was given permission to start the magazine on condition that the friary and the province would not have to pay any of the bills. Kolbe would have to raise all the money himself. And of course he did.
His weekly publication, The Night of the Immaculata, quickly became so popular that by 1927, Father Maximilian built an evangelization center near Warsaw called Niepokolanów, or City of the Immaculata. Here, Kolbe organized a growing number of Franciscan priests and brothers to write and publish the newspaper.
Lubił przytaczać łacińskie.
He liked to quote a Latin proverb, Festina lente, hurry up slowly. He would say, my beloved brothers, souls are waiting for the fruit of our labors. We priests talk to thousands, but the things you print will be read by millions.
Kolbe's words were prophetic. The friars labored at the printing presses around the clock to fulfill the skyrocketing circulation demands, often reaching over 1 million. An extension of Kolbe himself, Niepokolanów was a marvel of efficiency. It was a house of prayer, work, and study. And during World War II, when widespread persecution of the Jewish people began in Poland, it became a house of refuge.
He welcomed the Jewish family and hid them in our friary. And secondly, Father Kolbe ordered us friars to take care of the Jews. There were 3,000 of them here in the friary at times, and he ordered us to feed them just like Poles.
Father Maximilian was kind to all. He would never reject anyone, even his enemies. On several occasions when German soldiers wanted photographs taken with Father Maximilian, he would warmly welcome them.
Father Kolbe answered right away. Fine. He didn't give it a moment's thought. Father Kolbe had no enemies, and grabbed the phone right away and called Father Boniface. And he said to him, my child, he'd always call us children, come over with the camera. You'll take our picture in front of the statue of Our Lady.
Father Maximilian, like Sister Faustina, believed that one deed of mercy is actually a perpetual act, no matter how small or insignificant. He often stressed to the many friars under his supervision that a good example becomes a living testimony to those who witness it, urging all to imitation.
I personally thought of Father Maximilian as a really ordinary man back then. And only now, after many years of reflection, and through a re-examination of his life, as it were, as it is preserved in my memory, I discovered that he was like one of us, but he was not one of us.
Despite poor health caused by tuberculosis and only partial use of one lung, Father Kolbe never lost the intensity of his determination to evangelize, using the latest technology of his time. By the mid-1930s, Father Kolbe headed not only the largest Catholic publishing house in Poland, but the largest Franciscan friary in the world, where more than 700 priests and brothers lived and worked. This is the only film footage known to exist of Father Maximilian Kolbe. It was taken at a ceremony celebrating the 10th anniversary of Niepokolanów. Never one to fear the unknown, Kolbe had already decided to expand his media apostolate beyond Poland and even Europe. In March 1930, without knowing a word of Japanese, he set sail with 4 brothers to preach Christ's gospel in the Orient. He arrived in Nagasaki, Japan on April 24th, and exactly 1 month later, with the help of translators, published the first edition of the Seibo no Kishi magazine, the Japanese version of the Night of the Immaculata. Today, it is the most prolific Catholic periodical in Japan. After his arrival, Father Maximilian was inspired to build his new friary, Mugenzai no Sono, or the Garden of the Immaculate, on the slopes of Mount Hikosan. It was to be the Japanese equivalent of his Polish Niepokolanów. Locals said the Polish priest was foolish to build his friary on such steep ground, sloping away from the picturesque town. They were mistaken. On August 9, 1945, an atomic bomb leveled Nagasaki. Because of its odd location, Mugenzai no Sono was completely spared. It still flourishes there today. In 1936, after 6 years in Japan, Father Kolbe returned home to Poland and immediately resumed his duties as superior at Niepokolanów. But this time, a menacing shadow lingered over his spiritual city. The German secret state police, known as the Gestapo, viewed Kolbe with great suspicion. He was already labeled as an enemy agitator because of a magazine article he had published on truth. His influential newspaper was becoming increasingly more critical of the Nazis. The flourishing work of his spiritual army of brothers and priests represented a direct contradiction to Nazism. It was only a matter of time before the Gestapo would come for Father Kolbe. At 9:45 in the morning on February 17, 1941, a brother phoned from Niepokolanov's front gate. 2 Gestapo cars had arrived, demanding to see Father Kolbe at once.
I can't forget the moment, February 17th, when the Gestapo came. Some of them were in uniform, some in plain clothes. They gathered the arrested friars here. They were sitting on the bed and asking Father Kolbe, "So, Father, you printed that paper, the little daily here?" "Yes, I did." "So, Father, you allowed them to write articles against us, the godless Nazis?" "Yes, I did." "Then, Father, you come with us." They arrested them all, took them to the car. Father Kolbe blessed us for the last time and said, "I shall not see you ever again."
Father Maximilian was immediately taken to Pawiak prison in Warsaw. In an effort to free their beloved superior and friend, 19 brothers signed a petition offering personally to take his place in prison. Their plea was rejected.
It was an enormous prison, constructed under the Tsar's rule after the January uprising. There were thousands of prisoners there, and Father Kolbe was locked in there too. He was beaten there for wearing his habit. A German from the Gestapo, Scharfuller, yanked his rosary away from him and asked, "Do you believe in this Christ of yours?" "I do." And for each "I do," he slapped him on the face. And finally Father Kolbe fell to the floor, and the German went away.
Father Maximilian spent 3 months in Pawiak prison before his transfer by boxcar to Auschwitz in southern Poland. If hell has an entrance, it would look like this. Auschwitz was evil incarnate, a vile place of systematic atrocity surrounded by lethal high-voltage fences. For most who passed through these gates, death was their only escape. The administrators and armed personnel at Auschwitz were selected to carry out Adolf Hitler's program of extermination of all perceived enemies. To accomplish this goal, prisoners were subjected to a system of terror and refined torture. The camp's basic function during its entire existence was the killing of individuals deported to it. Upon his arrival here, the 47-year-old Kolbe was tattooed with his new name, number 16670. Like all new prisoners arriving daily at the camp, he was greeted with the same mocking speech.
You have not come to a sanitarium, but a Nazi concentration camp from which there is no other exit except a crematorium. If this does not please anyone, throw yourself into the barbed wire immediately. If there are any Jews in the convoy, you do not have a right to live more than 2 weeks. Priests can live 1 month, all others 3 months.
Today they walk freely through the camp's front gate. But when they entered this same gate more than 50 years ago, former prisoners Ted Wojtkowski and Adam Jurkiewicz had been stripped of every freedom. Both of these Polish men, now in their 70s, miraculously survived several horrifying years in Auschwitz. It was a sweltering day in 1941 when the destinies of these two men were forever joined with Francis Gajowniczek and Father Maximilian Kolbe.
Było około 400 więźniów.
Were around 400 prisoners. After the evening roll call, it was either in late July or early August in 1941, the Lagerfuhrer announced through his interpreter, by the way of reprisal for the escape of a prisoner, 10 hostages will be picked out and locked in the underground cell without food or drink.
Lagerfuhrer Fritz was the SS officer in charge of the camp at the time. According to prisoners, he greatly enjoyed the cruel and sadistic game of selection.
The selection was a horrifying experience. The Lagerfuhrer himself walked between the lines of prisoners, standing at attention. He'd look one in the eye and wave his hand. Step forward. Everyone was afraid it would be him. We hoped they'd pick only the ailing prisoners, the weak.
Lined up in order by height, with the shortest in front and the tallest in back, the men formed 10 rows.
So when they were counting, they count this way, and the selected prisoner were standing right on the other side, facing us. So that time, when I had my eyes closed, and I was praying, I said, God, please, select anybody, but save my life.
This angel of death, dressed as a Nazi, passed over both Ted Wojtkowski and Adam Jurkiewicz. But Francis Gajowniczek was not as lucky. The Lagerfuhrer stopped, looked directly into his eyes, and uttered the fateful words, "Step forward." His worst nightmare had become reality with a simple wave of the Lagerfuhrer's hand.
And suddenly I heard crying. And the prisoner which was selected, one of this, he started to cry, and he cried, "My wife, oh my God, my wife, my 2 children."
What happened next was a first at Auschwitz and still amazes these eyewitnesses.
All of a sudden, a prisoner stepped forward from the left wing, from the back line, and started marching toward the Lagerfuhrer. Everyone panicked. What now? We had just been punished for the escape of a prisoner with the selection of hostages. And now he stepped out of the line without being called. An unspeakable crime. He broke the military discipline. We were all standing at attention. No one would dare step out of the line without being told. But the prisoner marched calmly on. The prisoners responsible for the discipline should have reacted right away. The barrack supervisor, the room supervisor, or Lagerkapp. They should have jumped out and turned him back. They should have beaten the prisoner up and gotten the recognition for it from the authorities. But no one reacted, as if nobody believed that this could be happening. And the prisoner made it all the way to the Lagerfuhrer, undisturbed. He stopped in front of him and started talking.
Confronted by such boldness from a frail and weak prisoner, Fritz was visibly unsettled and shouted, "What does this Polish pig want?"
He stepped off and faced the commandant. And he said, "I would like to exchange the father of 2 children. Well, the Fritsch stood up, and he was kind of he didn't know what to do. And then he leaned over to him and he said, "You must be, who are you? You must be some kind of a crazy priest." And the Kolbe mentioned here, "Yes," he said, "I'm a Catholic priest." So again, he made a step backwards, and he got so nervous, and then he hollered, say, "Umtauschen." That means exchange them.
Kolbe then quietly joined the ranks of the condemned, never knowing the name of the man he had just saved. The still stunned Francis Kajowniczek rejoined the living. The 10 men were immediately escorted to the starvation bunker in the basement level of Block 11, ordered to strip, and then crammed into this small cell. From that point on, they were denied all food and water. Usually it would not be long before demented curses and animal-like howls of the starving, dehydrated men echoed throughout the camp. But with these men, it was different. Bruno Borgoviec, an orderly assigned to the death block, was an eyewitness to the starving prisoners' final days.
From the cells of the condemned men, every day there were heard prayers in a loud voice, the rosary, and the religious hymns in which even the prisoners of the other cells joined. In the moments when the guards were absent, I descended into the subterranean cell to talk with and to console my companions. The ardent prayers and hymns to the Most Holy Virgin resounded through the whole subterranean area. It seemed to me that I was in church. Father Maximilian Kolbe started, and all the others responded.
After almost 2 weeks of starvation and dehydration, only 4 men clung to life. On August 14th, 1941, the eve of the Feast of the Assumption of Mary, the red crown of martyrdom offered to Kolbe 37 years earlier was about to be fixed upon his head at Auschwitz. Needing space for new victims, impatient SS guards entered the starvation bunker and murdered Father Maximilian and the 3 remaining men with a lethal injection of carbolic acid. Father Kolbe's corpse was taken to this oven and burned. Despite his heroic sacrifice, many who witnessed it were already so desensitized by the constant brutality around them that they simply didn't care. It had been so long since the camp's prisoners had seen any act of human kindness that the splendor of what Kolbe did failed to register with some of the prisoners. It was out of the realm of possibilities. However, buried deep inside many of the men was the persistent reality that they had witnessed great sanctity among immeasurable evil. Gradually, the impact of Kolbe's selfless love began to manifest itself in surprising ways. No one was more surprised than Francis Kajowniczek. He later became ill and was placed in the camp's infirmary, where he again was an eyewitness to the power of Kolbe's sacrifice. But this time, that power would be manifested through a camp doctor.
And he told me that the Gestapo came into the infirmary and ordered all of the sick to be removed from their beds and brought to the gas chambers and executed. And the doctor in the infirmary did something beautiful for Mr. Kajowniczek. He placed his living body in a pile of dead corpses, buried Mr. Kajowniczek under these dead corpses, and by so doing saved Mr. Kajowniczek's life. Had Mr. Kajowniczek still been on the bed, he'd have been taken out alive and executed in the gas chamber. And so he continually marveled at how kind the other prisoners and concentration camp workers were to him in helping him to survive what amounted to nearly 4 more years of incarceration. And from that point on, he himself strove to show kindness and charity, humanitarian goodness towards others.
For those who survived Auschwitz, Liberation Day, January 1945, was an experience never imagined. Francis Gajowniczek was among them. Seen here 53 years later in January of 1995, speaking to a crowd in Hyannis, Massachusetts, Francis Gajowniczek told his powerful story of deliverance for the last time. He returned to Poland and died 6 weeks later at the age of 93. He is buried in the cemetery at Niepokolanów. Less than 8 months after Father Kolbe's heroic death, at a cafe in downtown Krakow, 30 miles from Auschwitz, the Gestapo conducted a mass roundup. More than 24 men were arrested, among them a 21-year-old plant worker named Karol Wojtyła. Although he was carrying an Ausweis card, identifying him as a worker essential to the German war effort, Wojtyła was still arrested. In the end, having the card saved Wojtyła, but most of the men arrested with him were deported to Auschwitz and executed before a firing squad against this war, just a few feet from the cell window where Father Kolbe had died. The far-reaching consequences of the young plant worker's narrow escape would dramatically alter the course of history. From 1920, the year he was born, inside this small 3-room apartment in Wadowice, Poland, a profound destiny would guide Karol Wojtyła. Tragically, that destiny would include extreme loss and sadness at an early age. When young Karol was only 8, his young mother, Emilia, died suddenly while Karol was at school. Afterwards, friends remember Karol as sad and depressed, robbed of his lightheartedness. And then, only 3 years later, his older brother Edmund, whom Karol idolized, perished after contracting scarlet fever. Karol and his father were left alone. Karol's father, a retired military officer and devout Catholic, was determined to provide his only surviving son with all the love and nurturing he could give. He taught Karol the importance of self-discipline, academics, and hard work. At age 14, Karol discovered theater and literature. Naturally gifted as an actor and inspired by his Polish literary heroes, Karol wrote, directed, and performed his own plays.
He was a very handsome young man. He was tall, with his head always slightly bent toward his chest, and with a big head of hair he could never tame. He had a beautiful voice and a very good delivery, but all that wasn't as important as the fact that he was so intriguing to another person.
From childhood on, young Karol displayed a wholesome devotion to God and religion. He possessed tremendous strength and energy, physical, mental, and spiritual. He loved the outdoors, spending as much time as he could skiing, hiking, and kayaking in Poland's breathtaking Carpathian Mountains. In May of 1938, at age 18, he and his father moved to Krakow so Karol could study Polish language and letters at the Jagiellonian University. The college campus was near the Franciscan seminary where Father Kolbe had taught, and only miles from Sister Faustina's convent. Karol completed his first year of college with excellent marks in all his courses, as well as landing lead roles in theatrical productions. The future looked bright for this budding intellectual. But a dark and violent storm was brewing in Europe, and Karol, along with all of Poland, would soon feel its destructive force. The early morning hours of September 1st, 1939, did not begin with the quiet surge of the Vistula River, to which Karol had become accustomed. Instead, he watched as Krakow, the city called the Jewel of Poland, was overrun by invading Nazi tanks and troops. The German occupation of Poland had begun, and with it, a new chapter in the young life of Karol Wojtyła. In a single statement, the German dictator Adolf Hitler commanded his army to eradicate every aspect of Polish life, intellectual, religious, and cultural.
I have issued the command, and I'll have anybody shot to atoms, but one word of criticism, executed by a firing squad, that our war aim does not consist in reaching certain lines, but in the physical destruction of the enemy. Accordingly, I have placed my death head formations in readiness, for the present only in the east, with orders to them to send to death, mercilessly and without compassion, men, women and children of Polish derivation and language.
With Hitler's order, Krakow's theater was to become the battlefield where Karol Wojtyła would fight German oppression, and his weapon would be the power of drama and the spoken word. The young actor helped found an underground theater group to sustain Polish culture. These clandestine performances were the front line of Poland's cultural war. Participation in the underground was an offense punishable by death. It would echo a mysterious lifelong pattern of close calls, where Karol's life would consistently be spared by God's divine mercy.
I would say that his life has been incredibly punctuated, from early childhood by those near tragedies.
At age 10, a gun fired by a young playmate went off, missing Karol's head by centimeters. Later, while he worked at the Solvay chemical plant, a fellow laborer was killed next to him by a sudden explosion. And during the German occupation, Karol was hit by an army truck, hurled to the pavement, and was knocked unconscious for 9 hours with a severe concussion. Still another time, during the German occupation, the Gestapo directed a massive dragnet in Krakow, arresting all males between 15 and 50. In his apartment on Tyniecka Street, as the Gestapo searched one floor above, Karol prayed silently, outstretched in the form of a cross on the basement floor. The soldiers mysteriously never searched the lower level. But while Karol himself eluded death at every turn, still death would invade his life again, as it had done before with his mother and brother. This time it robbed him of his 62-year-old father. It was February 1941, and Karol was only 20.
It was definitely a great friendship, a great love, and his last link with the family. And I guess, because Karol never spoke about it, that the death of his father was the last straw in Karol's decision to choose another path.
That path would lead Karol here, through the ancient Polish town of Częstochowa and the Marian shrine of Jasna Góra. Millions of pilgrims from all over the world visit the shrine year-round to venerate this 6th century Byzantine icon of the Madonna and Child. Jasna Góra, or Luministon, is the spiritual epicenter of Poland, an integral part of who they are as a people. Ironically, it was at this shrine where the destinies of Faustina, Kolbe, and Wojtyła mystically united. Here, God's mercy is manifested not only through individual confessions, but also through faith and hope in the midst of life's hardships, both individually and nationally. As superior of Niepokalanów, Father Kolbe organized pilgrimage to this centuries-old shrine for his friars. He would often celebrate Holy Mass at one of the side altars. And Faustina came here in 1933, where she prayed for hours before the icon, entrusting her perpetual vows to the Holy Virgin. And so it was in May 1942, weeks before his 22nd birthday, that Karol Wojtyła came here also to pray. Prayer was the spiritual compass he would habitually turn to for guidance throughout his life.
Yes, that is his most remarkable quality. A thing that characterizes Wojtyła best, the way he prayed, Actually, it was more than just prayer. It was as though he directed his whole being to God.
After immersing himself in prayer at Jasna Góra, Karol returned to Krakow, where he soon announced to friends his plans to become a Catholic priest. Joining Krakow's secret seminary during World War II to become a priest had fatal consequences if discovered by the Nazis. But Wojtyła had made up his mind to risk execution, and in October 1942 joined several others in the Archbishop's residence, where he was to pursue his clandestine studies.
We'd
say goodbye over breakfast. We had no way of knowing if we would be seeing each other that night, whether we wouldn't be killed or caught. I mean, death was everywhere, always by your side. You could get shot while walking down the street. You could die from machine gun fire. I had been hungry for 5 years. There was nothing to eat. So death in every shape and form was always close by.
In the face of widespread evil and the atrocities of war, the value and meaning of the priesthood became much clearer to Karol. Because of the German invasion, the lives of countless families were in chaos, and war orphans were numerous. He saw the misery around him as a challenge to which he must respond in person, one by one, face to face. While still a seminarian, Karol was assigned to look after a group of children, victims of the war.
Naturally, it wasn't limited to prayer. It was their entire life. One boy had nothing to eat. The Germans caught the father of another one. Someone got killed in a roundup. Someone had no shoes. Someone else had nothing to put in the stove. There was no coal. The day-to-day problems of the boys he was taking on just fell on him. And this is how he began to understand what ministry was about.
Years after his ordination to the priesthood in 1946, these early experiences never diminished in Father Wojtyła. Even as a professor of ethics at the University of Lublin, their influence was still being felt.
Our university was, and still is, back then it was even worse, very poorly funded. The students practically never got any financial help, and the living conditions were very poor. And people from all over Poland came to study here. Only a minority of students came from this area. And he initially left half of his professor's salary at my disposal. I told him who I wanted to give some money to, but he never interfered. Later, he left all his salary to be distributed among the needy. He stated only one condition: those who received it were not to know where it had come from.
Father Karol Wojtyła, at age 38, was installed as an auxiliary bishop of Krakow. At the same time, Sister Faustina's revelations were being looked upon by the Vatican with strong suspicion. Critics believed her revelations overlapped or interfered with existing church devotions.
We in Poland didn't think there was any interference, but the Vatican's opinion was different. Characteristically, Wojtyła, who was, after all, a bishop at the time, had reservations about the Vatican's decision. It only testifies to his greatness that he was mature enough to realize that a mistake had been made.
Faustina had predicted in her diary in 1935, 3 years before her death, that her mission would face seemingly insurmountable obstacles, but that in the end, God would prevail.
The time will come when this work which God so commends will be as though in complete ruin, and suddenly the action of God will come upon the scene with great power which will bear witness to the truth.
Bishop Karol Wojtyła was the instrument of that action of God, referred to in Faustina's prophecy. He exerted his influence and became a powerful advocate of Faustina's Divine Mercy movement.
He gave Sister Faustina's journal to the most prominent dogmatic theologian in Krakow, Professor Ignatius Rosicki. He had been his professor too, and said, please examine it from a theological, dogmatic standpoint. Check if there are any errors in it. I know it very well. I was practically with them, and I was absolutely sure that Rosicki would destroy her. I was really sure that he'd laugh at that little journal of hers. I was astonished when Rosicki proclaimed her work free from dogmatic error and deserving of utmost respect.
Wojtyła's continual support over a span of many years, both as bishop and later as cardinal, eventually led to the opening of the official church investigation for Sister Faustina's possible canonization. Wojtyła was convinced that if there was ever an age in desperate need of divine mercy, it was his own. The world was thirsting for Faustina's message, and he knew it. As a spiritual child of wartime Krakow, who had lost many friends to the grisly massacre at nearby Auschwitz, Wojtyła was painfully aware of man's dark side. He understood the more the human conscience succumbs to secularization, the more it loses the very meaning of the word mercy. He knew the world would continue producing atrocities like those of Hitler, unless good people acted against them.
I see him as a man who doesn't focus as much on standing up to evil or talking about how to avoid evil, as he teaches how to create good, and most of all, carries it into effect himself. His concern hasn't been to tell people what not to do, but to encourage them to do good.
Karol's ability to influence others, to create good, was about to make a giant leap. At 9:41 p.m. on August 6, 1978, at Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer retreat home, Pope Paul VI died of a massive heart attack. His successor, John Paul I, had been called the September Pope, because he died after only serving 1 month in office. Cardinal Wojtyła, who was part of the conclave which elected John Paul I, flew back to Rome for the second time in 6 weeks to elect a new pontiff. At least one person in Rome sensed that Cardinal Wojtyła would participate in this conclave not simply as a spectator, but as a candidate as well.
One day we were coming back to the Collegio when I asked him, "Did you buy a one-way or return ticket?" He answered, "Why, I'm going back to Krakow. I have work to do." But our Lord Jesus says, one must remain poor and give money to the needy instead of wasting it. Why did you buy the return ticket? He gave me that look. What's the matter? What are you staring at me like that for? Because, after all, you're going to be Pope. He just tapped his forehead. Are you out of your mind? Me, the Pope?
On October 16, 1978, the cardinal princes of the Church of Rome astounded the world when they elected as Pope the 58-year-old Polish cardinal from Krakow. Karol Józef Wojtyła, now John Paul II, the 263rd successor to the Apostle Peter, and the first Polish Pope ever, would be a unique phenomenon in church history.
You can summarize it simply by saying vigor unprecedented, range of interest unprecedented, depth of interest unprecedented, dedication to every and all possible cause unmatched, unprecedented. I do not believe that since Gregory the Great, his great role model, there has been a pope like him.
As a statesman of faith, proclaiming divine mercy to the world would be a major thrust of John Paul's pontificate. One of his very first papal writings was an encyclical entitled Rich in Mercy, released in 1981. It is considered one of his greatest spiritual works as Pope. In November of that same year, at a shrine in Colle Valenza, Italy, the new pontiff stated publicly his destined role was to bring the era of divine mercy into the world. The Holy Father said, "Right from the beginning of my ministry in St. Peter's See in Rome, I consider this message my special task. Providence has assigned it to me in the present situation of man, the church, and the world.
If you know the story of his life, you can see that he, and I don't want to sound bombastic, that he's always tried to be an instrument of divine mercy. And it had been self-evident ever since his childhood. His concern, his care for others, his relations with co-workers, with friends, and with the Jews. He had Jewish friends, and he still does. Later, as a student and as a young priest, he cared for the poor. I mean, I would want to emphasize this. He was very poor himself.
As if to put a divine seal on all that he had written and proclaimed regarding mercy, John Paul, like Father Kolbe and Sister Faustina, would also be given painful opportunities to practice mercy as well. On May 13th, 1981, as the smiling Polish pontiff drove through St. Peter's Square during his usual Wednesday audience, he did not realize he was about to make history. On that day, John Paul II would be the first pope ever to be shot. At 5:17 p.m., a 23-year-old Turkish gunman, Mehmet Ali Aja, shot repeatedly into the open-air jeep the Pope was riding in. Two Browning 9mm automatic pistol struck the pontiff. As he fell back, half sitting, half leaning on his secretary, Monsignor Stanisław Dziwisz, he kept repeating only three words: "Mary, my mother." During the 8-minute ambulance ride to the hospital, he lost consciousness and nearly bled to death. After 6 hours of surgery, doctors made a miraculous discovery. The bullet's trajectory through the Pope's body missed every vital organ. John Paul later said of the attack, "One hand fired the shot, another guided it."
I visited him as he lay in bed in Gemelli Hospital in Rome. I was privileged to see him on that occasion and to see the serenity and the love which expressed his total acceptance of this and his total offering of this for the church, for the gospel, and as a gift to the Lord. In this very act of victimhood, he was also the herald of mercy and forgiveness and pardon.
Ojciec Święty czuł osobistą potrzebę.
The Holy Father felt a personal need, not only to forgive Ali Aja in his heart, but also to proclaim his forgiveness to the world. It's not easy to face your killer, but he did it, and he did it with all honesty. I think he wanted to show people that this is what one had to do.
Like Christ, who forgave his executioners from the cross, the Pope visited Ali Aja in Rome's Rebibbia prison. His intent was to offer Aja his forgiveness personally. During their 20-minute conversation, the Pope and his would-be assassin often clutched hands, whispering to each other. Their conversation would have a lasting effect on Ali Aja. 14 years later, in October of 1997, facing possible extradition to his homeland, Ali Aja asked for a private meeting with the Holy Father. The purpose, he said, was so the Pope and I can immortalize our fraternal feelings before God. This way I can return to Turkey in peace with a free conscience, even though I will be in jail. In St. Peter's Square at the end of the 20th century, Karol Wojtyła echoes the ageless message of divine mercy. As he honors the lives of Faustina and Kolbe, he underscores the gravity and necessity of divine mercy for our times, and continues to proclaim its significance to the world. On October 10th, 1982, he declared Father Maximilian Kolbe a saint, describing him as a martyr of charity. Among the witnesses that day was Auschwitz prisoner number 5659, Francis Gajowniczek. Gajowniczek's very presence at the ceremony was a silent but striking testimony of Father Maximilian's act of mercy. More than a decade later, Pope John Paul II beatified Sister Faustina Kowalska on April 18, 1993, the Feast of Divine Mercy, whose establishment had been predicted by Faustina in her diary. At the ceremony in St. Peter's Square was an American woman proudly holding a banner. Maureen Daigen was celebrating the obscure Polish nun who changed her life. The silent river of mercy that entered unseen into the lives of these three seemingly insignificant people more than a half-century ago in war-ravaged Poland will surge on forever. It reminds us that within the grasp of every soul is the awesome gift to receive and dispense mercy. It flows through the lives of Maureen Daigen, Francis Gajowniczek, Mehmet Ali Aja, and now countless millions. In the end, these unseen rivers are united with still others as they empty into a vast ocean. It is an ocean of unfathomable depth, deserved by no one, yet accessible to all, even the most hopeless sinner. It is God's ocean of mercy.